January winters in North England can be cruel, especially when you live alone in an old house. I was sitting curled up on my couch, flicking through my book and sipping my cooling cup of tea as the world turned sullen and dark outside. The wind, as if kept back only by the meager warmth of the pale sun, began to prowl the streets in its absence. I could hear its fury rattling at my old window frames, and somewhere in the distance, opening and slamming the wooden door of a hidden neighbor's shed. I pulled the fleeced throw closer about my neck, as if at any moment some persistent tendrils of that outer chill may breach my home and find their way to assault me. I tried as much as I could to just focus on the words laid out on the page before me, desperate for them to offer a gateway into a different world. I needed it. Last year was rough, and I suffered the loss of my fiancé. I spent near every day since then reflecting on the void such a loss of love and routine can inject into your life and prospects. There are no words to encapsulate it, so I won't attempt to. It was only recently I could try, alone, the activities we used to do together. I relied on the warm glow of my lamp which sat on my end table, as it was energy efficient and I wasn't doing too well financially, having lost half of the income. Not in this market, not during these times. The rest of the house was as dark and cold as the world outside. It was almost impossible not to feel incredibly lonely when a sudden noise buzzed around the house, or rather, lack of noise. The lamp went out in tandem with the silence. I knew instantly that the electricity had gone. There was no general hum of background noise that you can only notice when it suddenly fizzles into nothingness. In some houses, the older ones, bills aren't paid once per month, but rather you have meters, in which you take your gas card and electricity key to a shop and top them up with credit. If you don't keep on top of it, you can find yourself in a situation like mine, even if you're practicing an economic lifestyle. My way of avoiding the admission that I've been forced into parsimony by circumstance. I could feel tears storming to my eyes, a stinging of bitter frustration festering about my nose, and a hollowness clawing back any normality that the tea and book offered. It was his job to keep the meters topped up. He had a routine. He had a set time to check. I was never on top of it. I could never remember. Using the torch on my phone, I guided myself up to my room, feeling that weight of misery, when all you want is for the world to swallow you up, for life to pause for a while so you can sob your way to catharsis. But insistent necessity tears you down from the pursuit of numbness into dreaded action and responsibility. I could have called my parents, or my in-laws, or even my brother, but that meant sitting in the darkness waiting for them, their veritable burden of duty, until they came over to sort it out for me. I didn't want to be a nuisance and, honestly, I didn't want to deal with a company. I did better processing my emotions alone, or escaping them. I wanted to force myself to read. The house was indeed chilly, and removing the throw inflicted instant regret. But I soldiered on, dressing myself in jumper, coat, scarf, gloves, trying to ignore the sentimental value of each one. The scarf was a gift from him. The coat I bought when with him. The tears would freeze on my cheeks as soon as I left, so I gently brushed and rapidly blinked them away. As soon as I stood foot outside, I felt odd, vulnerable. The street was empty and dark. It was 9 at night, so I did not expect them to be filled, but it was a different emptiness, a sheer lack of life. It felt like what I'd been harboring within had now reflected without. There were no kids' toys left in the gardens to be picked up and played with the following day, no scooters or bikes left on their sides, no gates ajar, just silent, quiet, closed gardens. I started on my journey to the shop with the key, card and wallet tucked away in my inner pocket. As I walked, I felt a distinct eeriness steal over me. My footsteps were soft and scuttled from my old shoes, and the wind whipped in wild waves, sometimes slowing my steps. I could hear it rush past me in a sudden gush, and the whispering tones slipped into my ear. Every now and then, the wind was overpowered by the melodic, steely clang of turbulent wind chimes, or the hollow, softer clink of their wooden counterparts. And the darkness was interrupted by sudden censer lights in the gardens that would offer a moment of clarity against the shadowy streets. It was strange to take note of the same streets I knew when they were under the blanket of night. The beautiful flowers in the gardens were all muted and monochrome, each one hushed and strangled by the darkness. The trees that bloomed from the pathways were lacking vibrancy, and in their nude winter state held solid like petrified lightning bolts. Perhaps because it was the first nightly walk without him, or because I had felt something was off since I left the house. I had a sense that I was walking in a different world, an unfamiliar, unsafe world, a distortion of what once was. I continued down the road, heading toward the garage, the place I went to top up, and down this road, a row of lampposts marched on either side, each one leading the way like a column of soldiers, their lamps spilling quaint patches of orange light before me. Two of them ahead flickered in a menacing manner, a constant battle of on and off, and the third, almost the same, kept losing power and regaining, but not in a flicker, but more slow, steady metronome. Something about it made me feel incredibly uneasy. I felt like as much as I was keeping an eye on it, something else was keeping an eye on me. In spite of the clear emptiness on the long road, I glanced up and down to make sure there was nobody else around, checking in the gardens, letting my eyes stroke across the windows only to find them all blocked by curtains. I was just being stupid. I was just tired, cold, and anxious to be back home. I was projecting a mood of unease. The light flickered once more, and I could see, standing directly beneath the lamppost, a single figure, a silhouette, unmoving, dark, undiscernible features. But I knew it was facing me, its shoulder broad and stance strong. I froze, perhaps matching its rigidity, but a thousand thoughts betrayed my outward stability, racing through within, until the light snapped off. In that fractional change, the most profound klaxon of imminent danger began to screech within my head, but, in a state of quiet panic, I couldn't eject myself from the situation. That would be a clear signal that I was weak, fearful, alone. I began to backtrack, slowly and steadily, keeping my eyes directly on the same point, as if the sudden shroud of darkness would allow whoever that was to steam ahead, but there was no sudden movement on either side of the street through the other dim orange puddles, nor could I see anything limned in the road. The light snapped back on and my heart skipped a bit, but nothing was there. I took a few seconds to breathe and decided against my better judgment that I had just imagined it. Forced relief was easier to adopt when the alternative was borrowing, uncertain discomfort. I had a propensity to let my mind run away with itself. He was the one who would always anchor me to reality. Whenever I panicked or stressed or froze in life, unable to make the next move, the best decision, he would always find a way to make sure I kicked back into motion. But whether I was being silly or not, just in case, I decided to go the long way. I retraced my steps, trying to act as if I had simply gone the wrong way and was rectifying it, not wanting to give any hint to a potential ambuscade that I was a prime target. But I rushed between the patches of light, even though between them wasn't completely dark. I felt like as soon as I stepped into a more diluted section of the bleak, broken pavement, I was infinitely more vulnerable. I realized, perhaps too late, that the longer way would bring me past the old community center. When I was younger, it was where everyone went to learn boxing, or share prayers, or whatever else the theme of the day was. But for years, it fell into dilapidation, with the constantly shifted and delayed promise of a wonderful renovation. It was still used by the youth, certainly, but not in an official capacity. Sometimes you'd see a few glowing, pulsating orbs of orange, and you knew there was a small huddle of teenagers there smoking cigarettes or whatever else. But that was always better than the alternative. Like any condemned buildings, in its absence of residents, it had become home to legends of ghost stories and horror tales in the intervening years. I'd prefer a group of ne'er-do-wells over the stresses of my mind. I thought, given the hollow breath in my chest, that it might be wiser to just go back into the cold darkness of my home and force myself into my loved one's nights, asking for their assistance. But by this point, I was halfway to the garage and halfway to home. I really didn't want to be a pain, and so, with one more nervous glance behind the street, to see that lamppost flash on, and no decent figure watching me, I decided to stop being ridiculous and carry on. The road that passed the old community center was wide enough, but very much unlit. I decided to walk in the middle just as I always did whenever I walked alone, to give myself enough space from either pathway. Like before, my eyes were trained on a certain spot, and that was through the three-pronged railings of the center. The building in daytime was colorful enough, with little murals on the walls that the kids painted, albeit clearly left to ruin, but at night it was just a series of black blocks poking in and out one from another. I tried to ignore the stories that were coming to the forefront of my mind. The caretakers who died there and could be prowling in the perimeter of the grounds checking for any trespasser, or the three ghastly children that could be heard laughing in the copse of trees, which is where they were last seen alive, or the widow, the original owner, whose haggard face could be seen watching from the window, basking in some spectral glow. There were too many, and my eyes were darting from window to trees to the side of the building, making sure none of these were suddenly going to take me by surprise. That figure had already shaken me up so much so that even if I were to see a group of miscreants, I know I'd be screaming as I ran back home. Though, whether lurking in the shadows of the center or the darkness of my mind, I couldn't shake this feeling that I was under the gaze of something. Goosebumps had stormed my body, my hairs were standing on end, and I felt flighty and fidgety, as if at any moment I would be confronted by someone. I watched with the vigilance of a hawk, and from the depth of my fearful mind, my anxiety ran rampant, irritating and exciting my paranoia, so that visions and shapes began to emerge. It was impossible, but it was as if I could see shadows, darker than the winter's night, fleeting across the overgrown areas, or lurking from behind the trees, or peering from smashed windows. I bolstered my resolve, telling myself that I was being ridiculous, and pushed onward, still not taking my eyes from the building. Just a few more seconds, and I'll be on the main road, in which I could already envision the garish bright light of the garage, offering a contrast to the unsettling darkness of this charged night. A sudden whoosh of wind took me by surprise, and I yelped at the spontaneity of it, and in a panic allowed my vision to furtively check the grounds and the building, just in case my sudden noise had attracted the attention of those spirits, and gave them all heed to rush at me at once. My mind's eye was full of the most tragic countenances slithering across the floor, or gliding from the window, or bounding across the ground, but, in reality, there was nothing. I decided it was best to stop focusing on it, and just continue. At the end of the street, the figure. It was impossible. For it to get there before me, it would have to... It couldn't. I blinked, desperate to wipe it from the vision before me. But it stayed, solid and stubborn, just as vague, just as rigid, just as still and menacing as before. I couldn't move, my feet were rooted to the floor, my bones as petrified as the naked trees that lurked in the distance. I kept my eyes trained on the figure as it continued to watch me, ignoring my wishes, my prayers, for it to dissolve and melt before me. I stared until the wind stole the moisture from my eyes and I had to blink. Upon opening my eyes, it had closed half the distance in that time. I could feel a sudden terror unfurling within, clawing about my body with a desperate intensity, and even from the community center, an urge, a silent chorus willing me to leave, to flee, to go, but I couldn't. I wanted to, but I couldn't. It just stood, watching me, and with its closer proximity, I could see that it was taller than anyone I'd ever seen before. At least 8 foot, 9, 10? In my fear, with my senses heightened, I still couldn't make out any distinguishing features, just a looming presence of doom, imminent, torturous doom. But I could hear myriad unspoken orders to run, run, run before it comes any closer. Something changed then. Tear glistened at my eyes and offered to nurture action. The last order, though there was no tone, no intonation, was unmistakably my deceased lover's. It was unmistakable. Whenever I panicked, or stressed, or froze in life, unable to make the next move, the best decision, he would always find a way to make sure I kicked back into motion. That was a catalyst I needed to spin on my heel, unknowing, uncaring. If this was a stupid thing to do, I ran faster than I ever had before, refusing to turn around me, sprinting back through the dark streets, highlighted in intervals by the lampposts or the sensor lights. The sound of my anguished breath and screaming lungs dwarfing the howling of the wind, the pealing of the chimes. I didn't look behind. I knew it was slipping between every void, every hidden corner. I could feel the terror it bestowed, but as long as I kept running, it wouldn't get me. I was being protected. I was sobbing, which I didn't realize until I was struggling to get my keys in the door, my tears blurring the task beyond its menial obstruction. As soon as I was back in the house, though dark and dreary, I could tell I was safe. I collapsed to the floor, finally listening to the endless complaints of my body, and ultimately I smiled, because even alone, even terrified, I knew that my late fiancé saved me that night from whatever the lurking, stalking, menacing presence may have been.